I am so honored and happy to have Professor Alaina Morgan here. She is assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Southern California. Trained as a historian of the African diaspora, Professor Morgan's research focuses on the historic utility of religion, in particular Islam, in racial liberation and anti-colonial movements of the mid to late 20th century Atlantic world. As part of a body of work of intellectual, political, and religious history, Professor Morgan's research teases out the connections between religious identity and racial formation, intellectual discourse, and grassroots activism, and local and global politics. Professor Morgan's first book, tentatively entitled Atlantic Crescent, Dreaming of Black Muslim Liberation in the Contemporary Atlantic World, considers the ways that Islam and Blackness were used by Muslims and non-Muslims in the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Anglophone Caribbean to form the basis of transnational, anti-colonial, and anti-imperial political movements. This book investigates the varying ways that Muslims of African descent thought of colonialism and imperialism, focusing at various times on European colonization, American neo-imperialism in Latin America, the Middle East, and the Caribbean, and on the idea of the urban inner city as a colonized and occupied space. Welcome, Professor Alaina Morgan.
Thank you so much, Professor McLarney, and thank you everybody for coming to this talk. I'm so honored to be an invited guest here, and I'm really excited to present this work. So, so before I was a historian, I was actually a litigator. I was a corporate litigator, but I was a litigator all the same. And in those days, I used to really savor the opportunities when the sea of financial documents and disclosures would part and reveal this treasure trove of information about people's intimate lives, right? Where did they grow up? Were they married? Did they have kids? Where did they go to school? And I mean, ultimately for my purposes, right? How did they end up as the subject of interest in a securities fraud case? In the world of securities fraud, you have to find drama where you can find it. And I feel like being a historian and being a litigator is different in a lot of ways. But one of the ways that it is similar is that in the years-long slog through archival documents of all sorts, you learn to piece together intimate stories of resilience, of creativity, and of the desire to find solidarity with people just like you. And so that's the way that I found the relationship that I'm going to discuss today, that between Elijah Muhammad, the supreme leader of the Nation of Islam from about 1934 to his death in 1975, and a young, scrappy Pakistani journalist named Abdul Basit Naeem. I began researching this relationship when I was in graduate school about 10 years ago. And the first thing that I found was the series of articles in the Nation of Islam's Muhammad Speaks newspaper written by Naeem during the 1960s. These began as reports on the march of independence of Muslim nations throughout the world, and they evolved into primers on Muslim nationalism and apologetics for the Nation of Islam's allegedly unorthodox practice. Then, of course, right, a WorldCat search followed, and I found a series of old journals written by Naeem in the 1950s and an introduction that he had penned to the Nation of Islam's Supreme Wisdom, which is basically their written compilation of all of the teachings that had been orally passed down up until that point. And of course, secondary source literature, right? Naeem had made it into a few histories written in the past 20 years, mostly as a brief mention. And so he's mentioned in classic texts on the Nation of Islam, like C. Eric Lincoln's The Black Muslims in America, and E.U. Essien Udam's Black Nationalism. And these mention Naeem's influence in and over the nation. Most recently, more recently, Edward Curtis and the late Manning Marable took up the issue of this relationship. And most recently, my colleague Garrett Felber has taken up the task of finding out the most about Naeem so far in his book, Those Who Don't Know, Don't Say, about the Nation of Islam and prison activism. Which leads us to the ultimate question, right? And the reason that I am talking to you about this, which is, why was the relationship between these two men significant at all? And what difference did it make to the way that the Nation of Islam interpreted their Islamic practice and their worldview? I think about this a lot in terms of, when I teach about what the function of biography is, right, in historical research, and why we care so much about certain people's lives and what those specific lives mean to the historical moment these people were living in. So my initial answer to this question is, this makes a lot of difference. I argue that the intimate relationship, and I take this not to mean sexual intimacy, of course, but emotional, physical, and intellectual closeness between Abdul Basit Naeem and Elijah Muhammad was a physical manifestation of the Afro-Asian imaginary that the Nation of Islam had begun to cultivate in the lead up to World War II, and which provided an atmosphere of hope and of promise after the war. Over the course of 2 decades, Naeem acted as a consultant for Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. Beginning in 1956, the year after the Bandung Conference of Afro-Asian Nations, Naeem almost exclusively wrote about the Nation of Islam in publications designed for consumption by Muslims in the United States and throughout the Muslim diaspora. He acted as the nation's most ardent apologist, short of maybe Elijah Muhammad himself and Malcolm X before his exile. And by 1957, he was engaged as a paid consultant for the nation and sought to use his diplomatic connections with the Muslim world. He worked for a short period of time at the Pakistani consulate in San Francisco. He acted as a travel agent of sorts for Muhammad's 1959 trip to the Middle East and Africa. And from 1960 to 1975, he wrote a column that regularly appeared in the Nation of Islam's newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, which began as a general report on the steady march of decolonization and ended with those apologies that I talked about before. And so before I start, I'm just going to give you guys a brief outline, but I just want to state this is very much a work in progress. I was so happy to have the opportunity to write this and to start to think about this, because this will form a very substantial portion of the second chapter of my book. And I had used a very small amount of information that I had dug up on Naeem in the dissertation. And so now as I'm revising it, there's this new chapter. And so any comments or questions or suggestions are very, very much welcome and will be immensely helpful as I move forward. So without further ado, and in a throwback to my litigation days, and as they say in the introduction to every episode of Law and Order, here are their stories. So this is how I'm going to proceed. Let me share my screen. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the context of the disposition, the African-American disposition toward Asia that framed the nation's early years. And the way that it was perfectly kind of poised to make a concrete Afro-Asian connection through Naeem and Muhammad's relationship. The second thing is the development of a post-World War II Afro-Asian movement through the Bandung Conference of 1955. Third, the manifestation of that Afro-Asian solidarity, that Bandung spirit, through Muhammad and Naeem's relationship. And then finally, the way that this relationship altered the nation's theology and their worldview, Not only did they refine their religious teachings, but they also connected Black nationalism with the successful Muslim nationalism that led to the formation of Pakistan, right? As they were watching with bated breath for all of these nations throughout Asia and Africa, more specifically, to finally become free from imperial domination. And then I'll just offer some thoughts in the conclusion. And so the first thing that I want to do is to give you not a primer of the nation, but kind of a really brief context of the situation that the nation found itself in and where the world was by the time Naeem arrived in the United States in 1948 and began his relationship with the nation in 1956. So from its inception, the nation was connected to Asia and the diaspora. In July of 1930, a light-skinned, straight-haired Muslim immigrant by the name of Fard Muhammad, and this is a picture of Fard Muhammad. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. This is a picture that's widely advertised, right, by the Nation of Islam. So if you've ever read anything about them or studied them in any way, I'm sure that you've seen this picture. By the name of, he appeared on the streets of Detroit's Black neighborhoods, and he took advantage of the then really popular obsession with the Orient. At the turn of the century, upper class and middle class white people had kind of already gone through this trend. People were obsessed with this idea of the East, and they were collecting things like Oriental rugs and textiles and all of these things. Mass production made it easier for middle class people to kind of acquire these goods. And now it was time, right, for Black people to have a turn at this. And so Muhammad, posing as a purveyor of fine Asian goods, Oriental rugs and the like, went house to house, enchanting all of the ladies of Black Bottom and Hastings with finely embroidered textiles and plush Oriental rugs. And so way more exciting than the vacuum salesman that were kind of going door to door this time. And he explained that Black American people were not Negroes, but instead were part of a lost Asiatic tribe of Shabazz. In their home country, their quote unquote home country, which Fard explained was Saudi Arabia, they were kings and queens, inventors of calculus, and powerful merchants. This was so inspirational because Black people were in large part simply surviving in the North. They weren't thriving as they had hoped that they would when they migrated out of the Jim Crow South. And to make matters worse, the uplifting messages of diasporic Black solidarity, power in numbers, and doing well for yourself that Marcus Garvey had preached at the turn of the century were barely at this point on life support. Garvey's arrest for mail fraud and deportation from the United States had left a Black hole. And Fard jumped into the void, and by 1934, he had converted between 5,000 and 8,000 men and women, began renting a meeting hall, and thoroughly stoked the fears of the Metropolitan Police and competing Black organizations in the city. And by 1934, he'd basically been run out of Detroit amid controversy and rumors of human sacrifice. He'd been arrested several times at that point. And so here's an alleged, possibly a mugshot of him. The FBI seemed to really believe that this was Fard Muhammad. Of course, the Nation of Islam kind of denied that it was, and there was a whole controversy about them offering a lot of money, which never changed hands, about if anybody could actually prove that this was the guy. So let me just stop for a second, right? Because you came for a talk, right, about Elijah Muhammad and Naeem, and now here I am back in the 1930s talking about the origins, right? But there's a good reason for that. Fard's identity has been so shrouded in secrecy, which is pretty consistent with Black messianic religious organizations of the early 20th century. He really wanted his identity to remain a secret, and there's a ton of conflicting information about him. He stated he was from Saudi Arabia, and when we think about it, of course, he said that he was from Saudi Arabia when he's trying to push, right, this Muslim organization, because what he's arguing is that he has the religious authority derived from the seat of the Islamic religion, with the most holy place, Mecca. His records, however, say something very different. He certainly was not Saudi. He was most likely Pakistani or of Pakistani descent. And he may have been born in either Portland, Oregon, or New Zealand by a British Pakistani father named Zared Fard. There are some clues, as journalist Carl Evans noted in the 90s, and a lot of that book needs to be taken with a grain, I mean, a big pinch of salt. But it's likely that some of the main teachings of the nation are connected to Pakistan in some way. For instance, it's likely that, for one, when he said that Black people were part of the lost tribe of Shabazz, he might have been referring not to a real place, but instead to the cult of the Sufi state, Saint Shabazz Qalender, who has a very wide following in Pakistan. And second, he renamed Elijah Muhammad Ghulam Ali in 1932. And this was very likely a way to pay homage to the founder of the Ahmadiyya movement, an unorthodox Muslim movement founded in the Punjab on the border of Pakistan and India in the 1880s. These missionaries came to the United States and very much targeted. I don't know if targeted is really the right word, because it has this negative connotation, right? I mean, they really kind of just took up residence and tried to convert Black people and communities in the Northeast and the Midwest. All of this to say is, as these pictures pretty much show, and I think that he would have argued himself, right? Fard Muhammad was not Black in the way that we understand Blackness to exist now. As historians like, right, Vivek Bald and my colleague at USC, Sarah Gualtieri, have shown, these processes of race making of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian people, particularly in general, but particularly at this time, is extremely complex. And Fard probably defined himself as being part of all of these categories at some point as it suited his needs. And people then took what was useful out of that, right? And so he probably, as we would say now, he kind of code switched in a way. And so through Fard Muhammad, we have potential early connection to Pakistan, but almost certainly a connection to Asia. And these pro-Asian sentiments were engaged by Elijah Muhammad after Fard's disappearance and in the lead up to World War II. In teaching that Black people were Asiatic, the Nation of Islam emphasized their political connection to the Asian world. They were certainly not the only Black radical or Black religious organization or set of intellectuals to do this. African American solidarity with Asia and the Asian world had been connected, had connections to the Asian world since the turn of the century. And in the lead up to World War II, one of the ways that this happened was by professing solidarity to Japan, and particularly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese in 1941. They used the Japanese essentially as the foil to the American government. And this was very much the idea, really, that my enemy's enemy is my friend. But there's also some thought that a Japanese victory would, in some ways, usher in the end of white supremacy. Obviously, there is an illusion of the fact that the Japanese is an imperial power on its own, and as part of the Axis powers, right, is in bed with Germany, which is openly white supremacist, right, and imperialist. But this is the way that it was framed. So Black intellectuals, and they're not the only ones that are doing this. So Black intellectuals like Du Bois, through his travels, academic production, and fiction, imagined a world in which African and Asian people were united in the fight against white supremacy. And immigrants from Asia as well sought to make these connections. It wasn't just Black people reaching out into a void or putting ideas out into a void. And one notable person in this context is a man named General Sarahara Takahashi, who was a Canadian and Japanese citizen who married a Black woman named Pearl Sherrod and founded an organization in Detroit called the Development of Our Own. Very early on, he did try to make interventions with the Nation of Islam, but he wasn't incredibly successful. Although I have found some evidence that perhaps the connections between those two men, Elijah Muhammad and Takahashi, were a little bit more robust than Muhammad let on to the FBI later on. But this is another way, right? This marriage between Sherrod and Takahashi, a Black man and, a Japanese man and a Black woman, that intimacy produced instances of solidarity and supported activism. And at any rate, the American government is incredibly, incredibly afraid of the Nation of Islam's, the potential infiltration of the nation by Japanese operatives, and loathed these teachings that the Japanese could win World War II and possibly unite the quote unquote dark races of the world. And this came to a head when in 1943, Muhammad went to jail on sedition charges. And interestingly, in the raid, so basically Muhammad is arrested in a 1942 raid at the Nation of Islam headquarters. They arrest 79 men and one woman named Pauline Bahar. And the only person to be released with no charges is actually the woman who was actually incredibly involved with the with all of the teachings and with the development of them at that time. So just something to think about, right? That gender dynamic. And so I'm coming to the end of this section now, and we have here an organization deeply steeped in and invested in the maintenance of ideas and real relationships, which connected the Asian world and, in the nation's logic, Islam with the African American world. And we see that in World War II, some of these solidarities that were expressed during that time existed, but they were pretty nascent, right? We have some connections, but it's not clear that this is as yet a cohesive formulation. And so that changes after the war, right? And so the end of World War II, as we all know, ushers in the era of Bandung and the rapid decolonization of what becomes the Third World. The world changes, as we know, significantly with the end of the war. The vulnerability of the European imperial powers is not lost on people of color throughout the world. And the other thing that happens is that the nationalist movements that had been brewing at the turn of the century reached their fever point. In 1946, Indonesia is the first to declare its independence from the Netherlands. In 1947, the British Raj comes to an end, and India and Pakistan are partitioned on the Indian subcontinent. And in 1951, Libya declares its independence from Italy and becomes a monarchy under King Idris I. And so this is the world that in 1946, Elijah Muhammad is stepping back into when he leaves the prison at Milan, Michigan. The Nation of Islam is in shambles. It's holding on by a thread. Clara Muhammad and Sister Bahar, who again is the only woman arrested in the 1942 raid, are holding it together. But even though it's in shambles, the fruits of these nationalist movements, particularly Muslim nationalist movements, in the case of Indonesia and Libya and Pakistan, are ripening. And this is extremely, extremely exciting. Right, we don't have a lot of documentation at this time, right? Because the nation is really kind of just trying to rebuild itself. Malcolm X is released from prison in 1952. That same year, the Kenyan colonial government declares a state of emergency as Mau Mau guerrilla fighters assassinated colonially appointed chiefs, organized labor strikes, and engaged in disruptive warfare. By 1954, Malcolm was preaching publicly about the Mau Mau and how they were driving British colonialists out. And he would do this during Nation of Islam meetings. And he was making connections between the Mau Mau emergency, the resistance of the Viet Minh and French Indonesia, and the radical resistance of Black people, all at the same time. And this is the beginning of an idea in the nation of Afro-Asian solidarity. And so this is an incredibly, incredibly important change. Before 1955, Afro-Asian solidarities, to the extent that they existed, were happening on an individual or an organizational level, not a diplomatic level. And so in April of 1955, this changed when 29 African and Asian nations met in Bandung, Indonesia. The conference was hosted by Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, Burma, which is now Myanmar, Pakistan, India, and Indonesia. So 2 of the hosts are majority Muslim nations. And all of the nations had, which were 29 African and Asian nations, had for the most part either recently achieved independence from European colonial powers or were well on their way to doing so. And so it was at this conference, in the context of the Cold War race between the United States and the Soviet Union, that the nations of Bandung created this third space, what we now call the third world, where they promised themselves that they would no longer be exploited by the West, right? And so Bandung produced what historians today and contemporary advisors like Malcolm X refer to as the Bandung spirit, where its afterlives persisted in these feelings of political possibility presented through this idea of the third world. And this was a way to really radically imagine the world completely. White supremacy would be turned on its head, the colonial encounter would come to an end, and capitalism would no longer be the dominant economic system. Primarily, though, it presented a challenge to global white supremacy. And so this is an important context in which the nation is trying to rebuild itself, just as the world is reorganizing itself after World War II. And to this end, it sought out consultants and advisors from the Afro-Asian world in order to create, in reality, this Bandung spirit in the United States. So the third thing is moving to this relationship between Abdul Basit Naeem and Elijah Muhammad and the larger meaning of the intimacies between these 2 men. Okay, so on January 27th, 1948, a 19-year-old Abdul Basit Naeem left his native Lahore in the newly independent country of Pakistan and headed across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Africa, and across the Atlantic. 6 days after his departure, the Statue of Liberty, a symbol of transatlantic cooperation and amity, greeted Naeem at the mouth of the Hudson River. And this is a picture of Naeem at about, he's like in his 30s in this picture, and I'll show you a picture of him very young. And on the right is actually it's a really bad copy, right? And I'm sure many of you have had similar experiences with like a copy that just like really hurts to your head and also does not scan very well. But this is the manifest from his initial steamboat voyage from the Indian subcontinent, right? And so from there, he made his way overland to Kalamazoo, Michigan, of all places, where he would begin his studies at the Western Michigan College of Education. At Western Michigan, he was active. He joined the Camera Club and the International Relations Club. And this is him in 1958. He's the second one from the right. That's him at 19 years old. Even as a 19-year-old, he was incredibly interested in sharing information about his native land of Pakistan. He was invited by the International Relations Club to share information and reflections about the infant state, which had just coalesced a year prior. As a Muslim living through the birth of this nation, Naeem probably recognized the power of information, of print media, of propaganda, of public relations, even the power of just kind of schmoozing, right, as it were. And it was the power of print media that, among other things, that led to the eventual independence of Pakistan and united millions of Muslims living in the British Raj. The power of information and media was not and would not be lost on this young man. In 1949, Naeem left Western Michigan and enrolled as a journalism graduate student at Iowa State University in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. By 1951, he was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania School of Southwest Asian Studies, but it's unclear if he was attending in person or by correspondence, because in 1952, his new wife, Zuleika, was also enrolled at Western Michigan, where she enjoyed many of the same activities that interested him. She was an active member of the Foreign Students Club. In the 2 years since he had left Western Michigan, Naeem's interest in American perceptions of Islam and the Islamic world and vice versa continued to blossom, as did his determination to facilitate this relationship. As a member of Jamaat al-Fala, a Pakistani Dawa organization committed to the spread of information about Pakistan and Islam, Naeem's activities were linked as much to fostering cooperation and understanding as fulfilling his obligations to spread the word of God. In 1951, he published his first known article entitled Pakistan and the USA during his time as a graduate student at Penn. And in this article, he lamented the fact that most Americans were ignorant of Pakistan's existence and origins. And he would seek really to change that. By 1952, Naeem had temporarily abandoned his ambitions as a graduate student and instead was working as a diplomat for the Pakistani consulate in San Francisco. He had gotten married and become the father of twins, Shahid Ghulam and Shireen, both United States citizens born in San Francisco. By 1955, at the tender age of 26, Naeem had returned to the University of Iowa. He was by then a father of 4, taking classes at the University of Iowa, taking care of all 4 of his children, including an infant by the name of Saud, while his wife was convalescing from an undisclosed viral infection. And he was toiling 65 hours a week at a restaurant, which makes me, all of this just really makes me feel like I'm not doing anything, because he's like taking all these classes, taking care of 4 children, right? So he was very, very busy. Times were tough for Zuleika and Abdul Basit. They could hardly pay their rent. They were on the verge of eviction. They didn't have the credit for a bank loan, and they had depleted nearly all of their savings. And in the true fashion of a man dedicated more to the production of ideas than tending to real world concerns like food and rent, he used all of his money on their new pet project, a glossy magazine that would unite the Muslim world in all corners of the earth. After a newspaper columnist heard of his struggles, Naeem was presented with a grant from a group called the American Friends of the Middle East, who gave him $330. And as some of my colleagues have actually discovered, American Friends of the Middle East was a group that was really kind of a cover for the CIA. It's unclear if he knew about this. I don't think that he did. I think he was probably just really stoked to get $330 when he's like on the verge of eviction and having this really hard time with his kids and his wife. But the fact that the U.S. Information Service, basically the propaganda arm of the U.S. abroad during the Cold War, was really interested in this publication and sought to acquire a whole bunch of copies of it, should really have tipped him off. At least I can see that in retrospect. I don't know if that's really what he was thinking about at the time. So the first issue of the publication, entitled Moslem World in the USA, this is one of the later publications, and I'll talk specifically about this one in just a couple of minutes, but this is kind of what they looked like. They were a tiny little publication. It was like a little pamphlet like this. And so the first issue of the publication, entitled Moslem World in the USA, promised to bring about a better understanding between Islam and the West in order to create stronger cultural ties. Its secondary goal was also the fight of communism and the spread of Russian imperialism. And at this point, and of something that he would abandon later, was very pro-democracy. This would also explain, right, why American friends and the US Information Service was really even interested in this publication in the first place. And so in order to promote this Western-Eastern alliance that he sought, Naeem highlighted the existence of a Muslim community in the United States and brought this to the attention of both non-Muslim Americans and Middle Eastern and South Asian Muslims abroad. The circulation was incredibly small. It was no more than 500, but Naeem had really, really grand dreams to make it bigger. Each issue of the Muslim World featured pieces which were a sort of primer for non-Muslims on Islamic law and Muslim traditions. And he included news from the entire Muslim world, but he focused very, very, very heavily on Pakistan, using it as an example of the diversity of Muslim experience. I thought this in particular was really interesting because despite the fact that he's part of a missionary organization, he's really trying to disavow the idea of orthodoxy and the supremacy of supposed Sunni orthodoxy over expressions of Islam that diverge from that. And Pakistan is a place that he points to as the home of many divergent religious traditions, divergent and legitimate religious traditions, right? And he praises not only, and in this, right, he praises not only Sunni and Shia Islam, but also Ahmadi Islam. And this is really, really unusual, right? So the validation of this, along with, as I mentioned before, he gives his firstborn son the middle name Ghulam, suggests maybe he was Ahmadi. I don't have firm proof, but things appear to be pointing right in that direction, and it would explain why he was so incredibly invested in the African American Muslim tradition. Regardless, even if he's not Ahmadi, his predilection to think outside of the box of Sunni orthodoxy really drove him to the nation itself and provided this context for him to accept and apologize for what many others in the Islamic world viewed as apostasy. By 1956, Naeem and his family had left Iowa and moved to the rapidly diversifying neighborhood of Bushwick, Brooklyn. And it was here that Naeem became even more intimate with Black Islam. He regularly prayed at Sheikh Dawood Faisal's American Muslim Mission in downtown Brooklyn on State Street. And it was in Bushwick that Naeem's path very much assumed the form of missionary activities that generations of Ahmadis from his native Punjab had taken off. In April and May of 1956, he began to publish on Islam and Black Americans, highlighting both Sheikh Dawood and reporting on his visit to the Nation of Islam Mosque in Chicago. And although he had been interested in this organization since his arrival in the United States, he had been unable to make contact with them until he was introduced to Elijah Muhammad by a man named Sheikh Diab, who had acted as a consultant and Arabic teacher from the Nation of Islam since 1951. He was on his way out with the nation. He actually disavowed any relationship with them and critiqued Elijah Muhammad in 1959. But after Sheikh Diab made these introductions, Naeem was then given access to the nation's headquarters in Chicago, and he highlighted this in the April and May 1956 edition of the Moslem World. After this, they were featured in every single issue until it ceased publication in April of 1957. For Naeem, he presented the nation as the totality of Black Islam in the United States, even though he knew, because he had had relationships with Sheikh Daoud, that this was a misrepresentation. From 1956 until 1957, Naeem published 16 articles and editorials on the nation in 5 issues of the Muslim World. And there's not that many issues of the Muslim World. This is an enormous proportion, right, of the publication that is actually dedicated to talking about Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. He dedicated 3 covers to the nation. This is one of them that I have up on the PowerPoint right now. And published one entire special issue on the nation's annual Saviors Day convention. It was so much, this was so much that he had to publicly state that he was not not colluding with them. He was not a part of the nation, and he wasn't getting paid by them. It was true that he gave them proportionately the most attention, though, but he also was very concerned with the processes of decolonization in the Muslim world, and he lauded the process by which Muslim majority nations had kind of kicked out their colonial oppressors. And so together, Naeem, Elijah Muhammad, and Malcolm X all have similar views of the importance of decolonization and the way that Islam was connected to the process of decolonization and the acquisition of freedom from imperialism and white supremacy. So Naeem's publication of The Muslim World and his burgeoning relationship with the Nation of Islam was only the beginning of a 2-decade-long financial and spiritual partnership. And as I mentioned previously, Naeem wrote the introduction to the Supreme Wisdom, the printed compilation of the Nation of Islam's teachings. And in that introduction, he wrote that the nation carried the spirit of Islam, and that that was the most important thing. And that even if they didn't have all the parts right, even if they weren't doing zakat, even if they weren't praying 5 times a day, that was not anybody else in the Muslim diaspora's business, and that eventually they would be able to get to that point. This also coincided with a push by the Nation of Islam to strategically manipulate both mainstream media to boost their national profile, and Black media to boost their national profile, and to actively seek relationships with Afro-Asian leaders abroad. And so to this end, Naeem served as a travel agent of sorts to Elijah Muhammad's 1959 Umrah to Mecca, and arranged for him to meet diplomats, leaders, and local Muslims throughout the Islamic world. He encouraged him to reach out to Gamal Abdel Nasser. And upon Elijah Muhammad's return, the nation used this grand tour as the basis for launching its own newspaper, Mr. Muhammad Speaks, later simply Muhammad Speaks. And this is actually, this next photograph, this is a photograph of Elijah Muhammad and Abdul Basit Naeem before a trip. So I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that this is right before he's making his kind of world tour. After 1960, the Nation of Islam had a very public media arm through their newspaper. And Fruit of Islam members, the male paramilitary arm wing of the nation, are required to sell it and could be punished in any number of ways for failing to do that. And even today, right, if you're in an urban center with a large Black population, you're going to see Fruit of Islam and bow ties handing out the nation's newspapers. And I miss that about Brooklyn so much. I missed seeing that in the at Broadway Junction, right, and then reading the newspaper on my my commute. In 1962, in this newspaper, Naeem began a series of columns in which he reported on goings-on in the Muslim world. By 1964, he was writing regular columns condemning critiques of Muhammad and using his authority as a Pakistani to vouch for him, right? So these columns, which I should have included some pictures of them, but would start off with something that said, Pakistani Muslim says, ... right? And so before any statement that he made, he would invoke his authority as a Pakistani Muslim, as a Muslim, right, from the traditionally Islamic world. And as this relationship bloomed, the nation also changed, right? They began to publish primers on Islamic practice, to instruct followers in how to pray, to include passages from the Quran, and to compare also the Black nationalism of the Nation of Islam to the successful Muslim nationalism of Pakistan. And so a lot of this is reflected through probably about a decade or so of columns and publications. And so in the interest of time and the format, I won't go too much into detail. I'm happy to talk about it more. But I'd just like to conclude right with this. Oh, sorry, that was the part four. So now I'm on the conclusion. The pandemic has had me thinking a lot about intimacy and relationships and the way that those relationships drive forward ideas and solidarities. And so I love to think about the relationship between these two men, one in his 50s and the other just coming into his adult years, and what they must have gotten out of it, right? I think a lot about what these men got out of their relationship, and what their relationship can tell us about the larger dynamics and the interplay between ideas, religion, and liberation. I imagine that for Naeem, this young immigrant from Pakistan, he was touching power in a way, however controversial, right, it must have been to be associated with the Nation of Islam. At some point, money certainly was part of the equation, but I have no evidence that he was making buckets of money, right? Like being a consultant for the Nation of Islam. But ultimately, it was in furtherance of a goal that he had articulated since his arrival in the United States, which was cultivating mutual understanding between Muslims of all stripes. And for Muhammad, having an Eastern Muslim, a Muslim from the Central Islamic lands working on behalf of his particular incarnation of Islam and affirming to him that his understanding and his tafsir was legitimate and based in African American experience and history, legitimized him, right, and pulled him closer to Muslims in the Islamic world and furthered the process of education in Islamic practice. So I will end there and stop for questions and comments, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Would people like to ask questions? I think you can feel free to go ahead and ask the question directly if you would like, or you can put it in the chat. I'll give everyone a few minutes to digest.
I had a question.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan. I was wondering, especially because you mentioned a couple times about Naeem's children. Do you have any information about like how he educated them, what schools they attended, and how that may or may not relate to the University of Islam, the Nation of Islam's own schools? I don't know.
Right. What's really interesting is that, so I have been working on this for such a long time, and it's so interesting because the technology keeps changing, right? The archival technology and the rate of digitization and all of these things keep transforming. And so back when I first started, I couldn't find anything on Naeem. I couldn't figure out where he used to live. I couldn't figure out who his wife was. I couldn't figure out what his kids' names were, right? I couldn't, did he go back to Pakistan? Is he dead even, right? Like I couldn't figure any of this out. Recently, I was able to find, right, these immigration documents, basically listing his children. And I have been able to find, I don't, I don't think he educated them in the Nation of Islam's schools. It would be interesting to know if they did, but I have been in the process of trying to get in touch with his son, his oldest son, who was a professor at Columbia in ecology, actually. So, who married a woman while he was in graduate school, University of Minnesota, I believe, right? A non-Muslim woman. So I don't think that that was particularly important to him, right? But it's so interesting to, right, to think about like people's families and, right, and what exactly you can figure out by knowing how their children were educated or where their children went right after they were grown, and whether they're still practicing Islam. And so I'm in the process of trying to get in touch with some of these, trying to find them, and he's the easiest one to find. The other ones, I've found some of them on Facebook, but I haven't like pulled the, like kind of pulled the trigger to DM them to be like, do you want to talk about your, and it's a sensitive thing too, because you don't know what a person's relationship is with their parents, if they're, still upset over their death, if they don't want to like have those things kind of be brought up. So I'm in a sensitive position, but as a historian that does a fair amount of oral histories, I'm looking forward to hopefully getting that perspective. Yeah.
We have a question from Professor Rasul Miller, who I mentioned gave a talk yesterday on Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija. Professor Miller, would you like to go ahead and ask the question directly? If not, I can read it.
Sure. Hey, everyone.
Hi.
Alaina, this was an amazing talk. I learned so much, and I can't wait to read more about it. So my question is basically, and I'm sorry I don't have my camera on. Yeah, not really mention it. I got the kid. But basically, I'm just curious to know why you think Abdul Basit Naeem might have presented the nation as kind of the only game in town, the only iteration of Islam after spending time, the mosque on State Street with Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija. Do you get the sense that he had any political or logical critiques of what he saw there, or I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that was what I was curious about.
I think that he was incredibly, maybe this is a little simplistic. When you look at, he was, I describe him as scrappy, and like that's what he is. He was just so like motivated to get his name out there, to build his career, to do what he had to do to kind of get to be public facing in a way. And so I think that, he went to Sheikh Dawood's mosque, right? He was associated with that mosque. And I just think that he might have seen an opportunity with the Nation of Islam that he didn't have with Sheikh Dawood's mosque to really kind of get in there and make an intervention. And I don't necessarily think that he, maybe it is that he had some sort of political critiques, because, I really believe just from the way that he presents Islam, and the way that he apologizes, right, or explains the nation's heterodoxy as part of a process, that he is used to and supportive of kind of alternative understandings. And I think that perhaps Sheikh Dawood was like a little bit too orthodox for him. That would be one of my guesses. I think the other guess really is just kind of, you know, he saw an opening there. And, you know, sometimes you click with a person, and I think that they like there was an opening for them to have this intimacy and this relationship, and to use that to push a new political way of thinking about the world and of Islam. I think that Elijah Muhammad gave him that space to do what he wanted to do, you know, obviously within the confines of the nation. But that would be, I mean, you just spend a lot of time like with these documents to the point that I'm like, you know, you feel like you kind of know a person, even though like you obviously don't, because they are dead and you're just reading, right, what they're writing. But yeah, so that's my thought.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. That makes me have a couple more questions that after everybody else asks theirs, if there's time, I'd love to pose, but I'll let other people go first.
Ellen, I think you're muted.
Professor Miller, would you go ahead and follow up on that question, and then I'll follow up with the other questions.
Oh, sure. Okay, great. Wow. Thank you. So, and I totally feel you about, you know, spending time with these folks and, and we start to think we know them. So I'm curious to know if there are other, I know you said that there are different, you mentioned that Abdul Basit Naeem named his son Ghulam, and that, you know, you get the sense that he could have been Ahmadiyya. Are there other things that are, you know, kind of giving you that hunch? I guess maybe the way maybe even some of the things he does, the tools he employs to try to argue for the legitimacy of the Nation of Islam or anything like that. Is there any other stuff you're seeing from his writing that gives you the sense that he had maybe an Ahmadiyya bent or Sufi bent or Shia or anything like that?
Mm-hmm. Right. So, yeah, I mean, so the two things really that I know, right, is the naming of his son and the place that he's from. Right, he's from the Punjab. Not that, right, just because you're from the Punjab means that you're Ahmadi. Great, that would be ridiculous. You know, and I think that there are ways that even if, I mean, it's a difficult situation because even now, right, being Ahmadi is not widely accepted. It's not like something that you're gonna run around, right, talking about or yelling about, right? And so I think that it's difficult, right? These types of situations I think are really hard because a lot of times as historians, we have a set of documents. We know that the way that people are presenting themselves is oftentimes the way that they want to be seen. Sometimes they're hiding things depending on, right, who the source is. And so the things that I have to go on, right, are kind of the naming of his son Ghulam, as well as, right, just the amount of inclusion of Ahmadiyya and apologizing for Ahmadiyya and other heterodox interpretations of Islam that he basically did in his writing. And I'm still trying to really kind of unpack all of this. And so I'm saying this to you guys, like, I'm like, okay, like, this is something that I'm thinking, right? But before publishing it, I think that I would obviously want to be a little bit more sure, have more examples. It's just the way that I'm thinking about it right now, right? Then something that I'm trying to try to figure out.
Yes, thank you for those questions. So Professor Barbara Schlegel von Schlegel also had a question. Would you like to go ahead and ask it directly?
I'm happy to have you read it for me.
Okay. Well, you had several. So do you want me to go ahead and read it then?
Well, I can't access it. We've had several more things entered, but I can't see it anymore.
Okay. It says, thank you so much. It was clear to follow Naeem's possible influence in the gradual introduction of the 5 pillars of Islamic practices into the NOI. what effect do you see from Naeem on the belief system or theology of the NOI? And she says, I mean, God talk and the continuation of prophecy. And then Professor von Schlegel also says that Naeem is accepting of heterodoxy, but what about in the other direction from him toward Elijah Muhammad?
So the second question, let me answer the first question and then ask for a clarification on the second question, right? And so one of the things that we do see is that as the years go on, Elijah Muhammad begins to introduce more Quranic passages, right? Excavations of the Quran. He begins to print these, right? And Muhammad speaks. They begin to more fully adopt, right? Like Malcolm X, right, says this, right, that he, right, doesn't fully know, right, how to pray when he goes on Hajj. After his death, right, Naeem is acting as a consultant in the way that Diab did. He's introducing slowly to Elijah Muhammad and to the nation traditional ways, right, of practicing and celebrating and Islam. But the thing that he does, right, I think that he is sensitive to this, is that there are manifestations of Islam that are very, in the Nation of Islam, that are very African American focused, right, very Black focused. The conversation about, right, white devils, or the conversation about separation, right, of Black people from white people, the focus on Black people specifically doing the best they can for themselves. All of these things, right, a lot of the things that that more orthodox, quote unquote, Sunni Muslims are critiquing about the nation, is that this is kind of reverse racist talk, that this is not something that Islam supports, because they support, right, this understanding that all men are the same, all people are the same, right? I mean, and as I've written about this a little bit, that even today, right, I think that, you know, when I have some of my Black Muslim students, right, or Muslim, understand that, right, that in practice, even if, right, the Quran is saying, the teaching is that, right, all people are equal under the eyes of God, that this is not necessarily the way that things shake out in practice. And so I think that he's incredibly sensitive to it. One of the things that begins to happen, right, is that the stories, the kind of crazy stories that the Nation of Islam is promoting about the origins of the world, right, like their eschatology, all of this begin to peter out. And, you know, it's interesting. I think that Naeem has some effect on it, but I don't know that he's like the primary. I don't know if he's the primary driver of this. I mean, the thing that I think that he absolutely is driving, right, is this attention that Elijah Muhammad gives to Pakistani nationalism. I mean, I think that in terms of, right, the belief system and theology, you really do see him kind of moving away from kind of the Yaqub myth, for instance, and all of these things. But, you know, Elijah Muhammad's really like kind of dug himself into a corner at some point, right? He can't double back on the fact that he's he can't double back that he's inherited Fard Muhammad's role, right, as the prophet, because that would delegitimize him. And so, but I think that he recognizes, right, that he wants to move away from it, and that's why, right, he leaves his son Wallace, right, in charge of the nation, because he knows that when he dies, he's going to make these changes, and he does very, very quick ones. And so the second one is about whether or not the nation is Naeem is accepting heterodox, but what about the other direction? So Professor von Schlegel, can you just clarify that? Do you mean, is Elijah Muhammad accepting of Naeem's practice, or is that what you mean? I'm not.
Yeah, I think that she meant that the accepting of the orthodoxy. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
but go ahead.
Thank you so much. You really cleared almost everything up. I was thinking specifically about theology and God talk and the nature of the Godhead, which in early NOI theology was actually human-centered, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is there a switch to more of it's Orthodox, but also Sufi Islamic idea of God being beyond all gender, all races, all everything, because there's no manifestation whatsoever. It's this cosmic principle. The force is Allah.
Right.
Yeah.
That I don't think really changes that much. I still think that at least up until pretty late, before Elijah Muhammad's death, they're still kind of maintaining that God is Black, right? God does also seems to be very male, right? And it's not right, and they're still clinging kind of to this more Christian dominated idea, right, of what God is.
Actually, absolutely. That's very good. So the incarnation idea of Christianity stays in there.
Yeah, at least up until
right,
Elijah Muhammad dies, and then Warthin Muhammad makes just very, very, very quick changes.
I kind of have a question that's related to that. I mean, for both you and Professor Miller, or just in terms of the discussion that's going on here, is that, I mean, my impression is that, that there were these connections with, Muslims who had immigrated. And then there came to be this kind of intense pressure on the NOI as more Muslims integrated with the, the Hart-Sellers Act. And you can much later, but you can kind of see the implicit criticisms of Elijah Muhammad and in some of the speeches of Malcolm X, where he's really pushing back against the critique of Elijah Muhammad as not being, a proper Muslim, right? And, really trying to justify it in in Islamic terms, that no, he is, of the like trueness of his Islam, right? So there's kind of a I mean, there's like these perceived criticisms and some sort of shifts toward a more some Sunni inflections as time goes on. And I think this is something that Edward Curtis talks about in that first book, where there's a real tension between his commitments to the Black community and then his courtship of the larger Muslim community.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's so, I mean, honestly, Ellen, I feel like you gave me a comment during the panel that we were on, and it took me like in this completely new direction. And so I really thank you for just pointing that out, because I really think that there is something about, right, the influx, like, so before a particular point, there is no influx of Muslims, right? We do have some Muslim immigration, but it's like the lifting of that immigration barrier, and kind of all of these Muslims moving to the United States and South Asians moving to the United States, right? Like really creates, I do think, a lot more pressure from the outside, right? And that could have a lot to do with the pace of Islamization, and really kind of the need to have somebody like Naeem around, right? And so I think that's something that I really want to think about a lot more.
I'm, Imam Wahid has a question, but before Halima Shah had posed a question, so Imam Wahid will go to your question next. Halima Shah says, "Thank you so much. I learned so much. Given that Abdul Basit was Pakistani and possibly Ahmadi, is there any indication that he might have been aware of Wallace Fard's foundational role in the NOI?"
Mhm. I mean, I imagine that, yeah, I imagine that he did, because I mean, I think that Fard is just such a, I guess unless the question is, do you think that he had any indication that Fard himself may have been, right, Pakistani? In which case, the answer is I don't, I don't know. I have no idea, right? If he was, and that's the other question really that I'm thinking about, which is how intimate this relationship was, right? And how, what are the secrets, right, that are revealed, right, to Naeem in the course of, right, this relationship? It would be interesting to know if he's only getting the party line, right, like Fardist from Saudi Arabia, right, like he's the Mahdi, right, he's the Redeemer, and that's it, right? Or, is Elijah Muhammad pulling him aside and saying, like, hey, listen, you know what I mean? Like, Fard Muhammad is not from Saudi Arabia. He's really like, of Pakistani descent from New Zealand, right? Like, and so, but I just don't think there's any way, I don't think that there's any way to know that. At least not based on the documents that I have. It's like, it would be just a total speculation. Yeah, it would be total speculation for me.
Imam Wahid, would you like to go ahead? Your hand is up. Would you like to go ahead and ask your question or make a comment?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. I actually learned something that I wasn't aware of, that I will certainly do more research on, and that is Abdul Basit Naeem. Just a couple of comments. One is that the Nation of Islam was a strategy to bring about a healthy sense of dignity and pride in Black people in America. And it wasn't just designed for the nation. Mr. Farad had his eyes on all African Americans to bring us all up. The other thing is that Elijah Muhammad made it very clear that he wasn't teaching religion. Though they had religious language, it was clear in the membership that they wasn't getting taught religion, but it was a message to wake them up and to give them a sense of dignity like every other people. And he was very emphatic. The teachings was, in fact, the picture you showed of Mr. Farad, there's another very, very popular picture. I don't know if you've seen it, with Mr. Farad, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and Imam W.D. Muhammad in one picture, which was a symbol of that continuity of the religion, starting with Mr. Farad and Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and then continuing bringing us into the fullness of Islamic life, which you mentioned. Imam W.D. Muhammad did that quickly, and you're correct about that. He did it very quickly, but very methodically and very sensitive to the teaching of the community at that time. So thank you for introducing me to Mr. Abdul Basit Naeem. I certainly will do some more research on him. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Jalil Atum, would you like to go ahead and ask your question? Let me see here. He's right here. Jalil, do you have your hand up? Let's see.
I think he may have accidentally. I think it might be a butt hand raise.
Okay. Yeah. Let me see. Okay, so Hamad, would you like to go ahead and ask your question directly of Alaina, or would you like for me to read it? It says, do you know what was the reaction of Naeem toward the separation of Malcolm X from the NOI? This could elaborate some of Naeem's belief.
Yeah, well, he completely sided with Elijah Muhammad.
Okay.
He condemns Malcolm X, saying that he was that he was, I mean, basically completely out of line, a traitor. And then he kind of used, and then when he was assassinated, he kind of used his own words about the chickens coming home to roost against him.
Yikes. Yeah.
So he was very much on the side of of the nation. After that, now again, right? I don't, you know, I'm not I'm not sure if this was something that he really felt in his heart, or if this is right like a political position that he had. Right, he has this kind of job with the nation. He's in the inner circle basically of Elijah Muhammad, and right, feels like he should take that that role. But I mean, yeah, so he sided with the with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam.
Let me see, maybe Jaleel. Jaleel, do you have a question? You'll have to unmute yourself. But maybe not. Erase. Jaleel. Okay. Jaleel, did you have a question? All right, I just wanted to make sure, just because he seemed to raise his hand twice. You know, I have a question. You know, I think there were also questions yesterday in Professor Miller's talk around, you know, orthodoxy, unorthodoxy, and there seems to be kind of a little bit of a, I would say, you know, these are old questions that are asked a lot. I had a different question about, you know, what you mentioned, the CIA sponsoring Moslem World. And, you know, there's other very interesting organizations, you know, at the time that were sponsored by the CIA, like the American Society of African Culture, who sponsored, you know, the first like Congress of Negro writers in, I think, 1959. And then they did an edited volume that became very important. And you know, the World Festival of the U.S. delegation to the World Festival of Negro Arts in 1966 was sponsored by the CIA. The literary journal Preuve, that was also sponsored by the CIA, where Baldwin published his article on the Congress of Black Writers and Artists, the article Princes and Powers. You know, there's all these kind of like, you know, the CIA, you know, giving money to these very, I would say, to these Black radical organizations. I mean, obviously, through the aim of like co-optation or, you know, infiltration. And yet, you know, I mean, can you kind of interpret for us their aims and, you know, how this kind of functioned in that way? It's sort of confounding. I mean, there are these like kind of Black radical organizations that have these like cultural flourishing, while the CIA. So what's the CIA doing? Why are they doing this? And, you know, and what are their aims of sponsoring the Moslem World, for example?
Well, I mean, I think that there's maybe a couple of things that they're doing. I'm not sure about the other publications, right, that you're talking about. But and I thank you, and I'll definitely like look into this, because there's definitely something going on. But you know, I think that this is the Cold War. It's like the height of the Cold War. The United States is very much interested in promoting any kind of anti-communism, right? Any kind of appeal to anybody, right, in that part of the world to kind of not adopt communism, or to, you know, allow the Soviet Union right into their orbit. And I think that given the fact that the Soviet Union was in many respects right intervening repeatedly in the Muslim world, I think the CIA probably was like jumped on the fact that somebody was basically writing this publication that was condemning communism and promoting right American democracy more than anything. And so I think that that's really their aim. I think that it's really interesting to think about it now, because you would think if the CIA was supporting that kind of publication or movement, it would most certainly be to like keep tabs on it, to make sure that right, like to look at all of this wait, hold on, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought because I was looking at the chat. But
yeah
yeah, so I think that so I think that that's what it was about. I think that it's hard for us to think about it now, because if you think about right, why would the CIA want to keep tabs right on like a Muslim organization? Like almost certainly right, we think of it in terms of, oh, this is for like surveillance, right? Like this is for keeping tabs on these people so that, you know, the government can keep a close eye on them, because they don't think that they have good intentions. But you know, I think that in this context of the Cold War, the US was trying to support like literally like any national or international efforts that it could to like delegitimize the Soviet Union, right? So it honestly, like, it makes sense. And I don't think that even if it was sponsored by the CIA, I mean, I think that some people look at it as a potential way that they could be like that right, that Naeem could be delegitimized. I don't think that it really makes I don't think that it influenced what he was doing, right? Like I don't think that that $330 from the American Friends, which is really like the CIA, really changed his worldview. I think that his worldview is pretty consistent from the moment that he kind of arrived in the US. So I don't really think that he was much influenced right by it. I think he was really happy to have the money. He was going through a really hard time right then. So
yeah, I mean, I guess that makes sense in terms of what you're talking about in terms of like sort of the power of Black communism. And you know, as you know, as a emancipatory discourse in the face of like a very oppressive government. But Brother Jalil says that he was a student of Brother Naeem from 1984 to 1992, and that he was given his first and middle name by him. And he says he influenced many of the followers of the NOI, and especially the children of NOI in early 70s and 80s. I and a group of Muslims learned Arabic from him every Sunday morning at his home in Jefferson Madison, Brooklyn. Any last dates on his passing? I was told he was taken back to Pakistan. I and a generation of Muslims are greatly positively strengthened in Islam because of him. That is just so amazing.
amazing.
And
Yeah,
brother, maybe he can give you. I'll put your email in the
yeah,
chat so that maybe you guys can get in touch.
yeah, I mean, that
Yeah,
would be
but
wonderful. Please, Brother Jaleel, please message me, because I would love to talk to you about this, because I have been trying to find out anything that I can find out about him after right the 1970s, and have kind of hit a wall with that. So if you could email me, I would be eternally grateful. Thank you so much.
that is
Thank
really
you for
wonderful.
sharing.
And thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was amazing. I'm like so grateful to all of you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have written this and to have thought about it with such smart and brilliant people. And I am, I'm looking forward to talking to some of you in the future. And please email me if anything else comes to mind.
So any last questions for Professor Morgan? Okay, I think this has been such an amazing talk. I am so honored that you agreed to join us. This has been an amazing talk and an amazing group of people and participants. And thank you all for making this happen. Next week.